Dear listeners, this channel publishes only full and exclusive audio stories. Please subscribe and like them if you enjoy them.
Chapter 1: The Road to the Lake. The rain had stopped less than an hour before she left the highway. By then the world already looked softer, quieter, as though the storm had pressed everything gently downward and left behind only mist and silence. The narrow road curved through pine trees darkened by water, their branches heavy and still. Thin fog drifted between the trunks in pale ribbons, moving slowly across the headlights of her car. Elena loosened one hand from the steering wheel and lowered the window a few inches. Cold air entered immediately. It smelled of wet cedar, moss, and distant fresh water. She breathed it in carefully. For the first time in months, maybe longer, there was nothing around her except the road. No notifications. No passing trains. No apartment walls carrying the sounds of strangers. No elevators opening and closing all night. Only the tires rolling over damp pavement. The GPS signal had disappeared 20 minutes earlier. She no longer minded. The directions written on the folded piece of paper beside her were simple enough. Stay on Lake Vesper Road until the trees thin. Cross the small bridge. Continue to the end. The house sits alone. That final sentence had stayed in her mind since she first read the rental listing 3 weeks ago. The house sits alone. At the time, she had imagined peace when she read it. Privacy. A silence large enough to rest inside. Now, driving deeper into the woods while evening gathered itself slowly around the road, the sentence felt slightly different. Not threatening. Just strange. As though the house had been waiting in its solitude for a very long time. She adjusted the heat inside the car. The windshield fogged faintly at the edges. Beyond the trees, she began catching brief glimpses of water through the darkness, silver reflections trembling between branches. The lake. It appeared and disappeared again. A bend in the road revealed more of it suddenly, an enormous sheet of dim gray stretching beneath the cloudy evening sky. The surface was perfectly still. No boats. No lights. No movement at all. Elena slowed the car instinctively. Something about the lake made her feel she should not rush past it. The road narrowed further ahead, becoming gravel. Tiny stones crackled beneath the tires. Pine needles covered the edges like soft brown fur. Somewhere far off, a bird called once and then fell silent again. She passed 3 mailboxes leaning near the roadside. Then 2. Then none. The forest thickened once more before opening without warning onto a narrow wooden bridge crossing black water. The bridge looked older than she expected. Its rails were silver with age, weathered almost smooth. The planks beneath the tires made hollow sounds that echoed softly over the lake. Halfway across, Elena glanced to her left. Mist drifted low across the water there, moving so slowly it almost seemed motionless. And beyond it, a light. Very faint. A single yellow glow on the far shoreline. She assumed it belonged to another house, though it looked oddly isolated standing there alone against the dark trees. For a moment she wondered who lived out here year-round. Someone who liked silence, perhaps. Someone hiding from the world. Or someone who had simply stayed long enough to become part of the landscape itself. The bridge ended. The road climbed gently uphill. And then she saw the house. At first it appeared only in fragments through the trees, the angled roofline, pale windows reflecting dusk, the dark shape of a porch. Then the forest opened fully. The house stood at the very edge of the lake. Beautiful was the first word that came to her. Not grand. Not luxurious. But deeply beautiful in the way old places sometimes are when they belong completely to their surroundings. The exterior was painted a faded charcoal blue. Warm amber lights glowed behind several windows downstairs. The porch wrapped around the front corner facing the water. Moss grew between the stones of the pathway leading to the steps. Behind the house the forest rose quietly into darkness. In front of it, the lake stretched outward like polished glass. Elena parked slowly beside a small detached garage. When she turned off the engine, the silence startled her. It was complete. Not city silence, where distant sounds always remain beneath everything. This silence felt deeper. Natural. Almost watchful. She sat there for a moment with her hands resting loosely in her lap. Rainwater dripped softly from the trees overhead. Somewhere near the shore, water touched stone in slow rhythmic movements. Otherwise, nothing. She realized suddenly how tired she was. Not ordinary tiredness. A deeper exhaustion she had carried for so long that it had begun to feel permanent. The last year had blurred into crowded trains, unfinished conversations, late-night work emails glowing in dark rooms, meals eaten standing at kitchen counters, insomnia, noise, endless movement. And beneath all of it, the quiet collapse of a life she no longer recognized. When she first rented the house, she told herself she only needed a month away. A month to sleep. To think. To become recognizable to herself again. But sitting there now beneath the darkening sky, she felt something stranger. As though the world she came from had already become distant. She stepped out of the car. Cold gravel shifted beneath her boots. The air near the lake carried a faint mineral scent, clean and ancient. Tiny droplets of moisture clung to her hair immediately. The porch light had been left on for her. She walked toward it slowly, suitcase wheels bumping softly behind her. The wooden steps creaked gently beneath her weight. Not sharply. Not unpleasantly. The sounds felt lived in. The front door key was hidden exactly where the owner had described, in a small ceramic planter beside the bench. Elena reached inside. Her fingers brushed cold metal immediately. But something else was there too. A folded piece of paper. She paused. The note was small, yellowed slightly at the edges. Not new. She unfolded it beneath the porch light. The handwriting was elegant and narrow. There's fresh wood for the stove if the nights get cold. The upstairs window sticks when it rains. And the lake is quieter before sunrise. No signature. Elena frowned slightly. Perhaps the owner had left instructions and forgotten to mention them. Still, something about the note felt oddly personal. Not like instructions prepared for guests. More like reminders written for someone already familiar with the house. She turned the paper over. Blank. Behind her, the lake remained perfectly still. A faint unease moved through her then, not fear exactly, but awareness. The feeling that she had arrived somewhere carrying the shape of another person's life. The front door opened with surprising ease. Warmth greeted her immediately, along with the faint scent of cedar smoke. She stepped inside slowly. The house was dimly lit by lamps rather than overhead lights. Soft amber pools illuminated parts of the living room while corners remained shadowed and calm. A fire had recently burned in the stone fireplace. The last traces of heat still lingered in the room. Elena closed the door quietly behind her. Wooden floors stretched throughout the main level, worn smooth with age. Bookshelves lined one wall beside large windows overlooking the lake. A wool blanket lay folded carefully over the arm of a long sofa. Nothing felt staged. That was the first unusual thing she noticed. Vacation rentals usually carried a certain emptiness beneath their decorations, a temporary quality. But this house still felt inhabited somehow. Not occupied. Just emotionally arranged. As though someone had stepped outside briefly and might return at any moment. She walked farther into the living room. An old record player stood near the shelves. Beside it rested a small ceramic bowl filled with smooth stones collected from the shoreline. A mug sat drying beside the kitchen sink. One mug. Not hidden away in a cabinet. Simply left there. Elena stared at it for a moment longer than necessary. Then she reminded herself that the owner likely cleaned in a hurry between guests. Still, she could not shake the feeling that she was entering the quiet continuation of something already in progress. The kitchen windows faced west. Outside them, evening light faded slowly across the lake, turning the water from silver into deep blue-gray. She opened the refrigerator. Inside waited simple supplies exactly as promised in the rental listing: bread, butter, eggs, tea, fruit, a bottle of wine. Enough for the first evening. On the top shelf sat a glass jar containing sprigs of lavender tied with string. No explanation. She smiled faintly despite herself. The detail felt strangely tender. As though someone had wanted the house to smell pleasant for her arrival. She carried her suitcase upstairs. The staircase curved gently along a wall lined with framed black and white photographs. Most showed the lake during different seasons. Winter ice. Summer fog. Rain moving across dark water. But halfway up the stairs, she stopped. One photograph was different. It showed the porch itself many years earlier. A woman sat on the steps wrapped in a blanket, looking toward the lake. Her face was turned away from the camera. Yet something about the image held Elena's attention immediately. Not because the woman seemed mysterious. Because the photograph felt intimate. Unposed. Taken by someone who loved her. Elena moved closer. The frame was slightly dusty. At the bottom corner, nearly hidden in fading ink, a date remained visible. October 1998. Almost 30 years ago. She continued upstairs more slowly after that. The hallway above was narrow and peaceful. Soft lamplight glowed from a bedroom near the end. Another door stood partially open farther down, revealing darkness beyond. And somewhere in the house, very faintly, she heard music. Elena stopped completely. A piano. Just a few distant notes. Slow. Gentle. Almost uncertain. Her heart tightened unexpectedly. Then she realized it was coming from outside. She crossed to the nearest window. Across the lake, barely visible through drifting mist, stood the distant yellow light she had noticed earlier from the bridge. The music carried faintly over the water. Someone playing piano with the windows open. The melody was simple and wandering, dissolving into silence between phrases. Elena stood listening. The sound made the entire lake feel inhabited in a different way. Not empty wilderness, but scattered human lives existing quietly beyond one another's sight. After a few moments the music stopped. The silence that followed seemed even deeper than before. She finally entered the bedroom. The room overlooked the water directly. Moonlight had begun appearing faintly behind clouds, silvering the surface of the lake below. The bed was neatly made with heavy linen blankets. A small reading lamp glowed warmly beside stacked books on the nightstand. One of them lay open face down. Elena stared at it. Again that same feeling. Someone had been here. Not physically. Emotionally. The open book made the room feel paused rather than empty. She touched its cover gently. A collection of poems. A dried fern rested between the pages as a bookmark. Outside, wind moved softly through the trees for the first time all evening. The branches brushed faintly against the roof. Elena sat carefully on the edge of the bed. The exhaustion inside her returned all at once then, heavier than before. But beneath it was something else too. Curiosity. Not sharp or fearful curiosity. A quieter feeling. Like standing at the edge of a memory that did not belong to her. Downstairs, somewhere within the old wooden walls, the house settled softly around her. And beyond the windows, the dark lake breathed beneath the night. Chapter 2: The Empty House. Elena woke before dawn without knowing why. For several moments she remained still beneath the heavy blankets, suspended in that soft space between dreaming and waking. The room was blue with early morning light. Beyond the windows, the lake stretched pale and endless beneath a veil of mist. The silence felt enormous. Not uncomfortable. Just complete. Then she heard it again. A faint sound downstairs. Not movement exactly. More like the gentle shifting of old wood settling into colder air. She closed her eyes briefly, listening. Nothing followed. Eventually she sat up slowly and rubbed warmth into her hands. The room carried a slight chill now that the fire downstairs had burned out overnight. Somewhere outside, water lapped softly against the shoreline rocks in slow rhythmic intervals. The house felt different in the morning. At night it had seemed intimate and shadowed, filled with warm corners and quiet mystery. But daylight revealed its age more clearly. The ceiling beams above her bore thin cracks in the wood. The curtains had faded slightly from years of sun. The floorboards carried tiny scratches from countless footsteps. Human traces. Not decorative ones. Real ones. Elena dressed slowly and crossed toward the window. The lake had almost disappeared beneath the mist. Only the nearest stretch of water remained visible, smooth as frosted glass. The opposite shoreline was gone entirely, along with the distant house where someone had played piano the evening before. She wondered briefly who lived there. An older couple, perhaps. Or someone retired from the city, seeking the same silence she had come here to find. The thought comforted her slightly. It made the lake feel less isolated. She left the bedroom and stepped quietly into the hallway. The upstairs carried a faint scent she hadn't noticed the night before. Lavender, perhaps. Or cedar from the old walls warming slowly with the morning. The partially open door at the far end of the hall drew her attention again. Last night she had been too tired to investigate it. Now curiosity returned. She crossed the hallway and pushed the door gently wider. The room beyond appeared untouched. Dust floated in pale strips of light near the windows. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, crowded with books and old boxes. Near the far corner stood a wooden desk facing the lake. And beside it, a narrow bed. Elena paused. The room was not abandoned exactly. It simply felt preserved. Like a space no longer actively used but never fully emptied either. A knitted blanket remained folded neatly across the bed. Several pencils rested inside a ceramic cup on the desk. A pair of reading glasses lay beside stacked notebooks. She stepped farther inside. The floor creaked softly beneath her weight. On the desk sat a small framed photograph turned slightly toward the window. Elena hesitated before lifting it. It showed the lake in winter. Two figures stood near the frozen shoreline wearing heavy coats. One held a lantern. Snow blurred the edges of the image. Their faces were too distant to distinguish clearly. Yet once again the photograph carried that same feeling she had noticed downstairs. Intimacy. Not posed memory, but ordinary life quietly captured. She set the frame back carefully. One of the notebooks beside it had swollen slightly from moisture over time. Its pages were warped at the edges. Elena touched the cover absent-mindedly but did not open it. The room felt too personal for that. Instead, she moved toward the shelves. Most of the books were novels, poetry collections, and gardening guides. Others focused on birds, local trees, weather patterns on northern lakes. Several carried library stamps dated decades earlier. Then she noticed something unexpected. A tiny music box resting near the end of the shelf. Its silver paint had worn away at the corners. One delicate crack ran across the lid. Elena picked it up carefully. When she opened it, the mechanism inside gave a soft metallic click before releasing a melody so faint she almost thought she imagined it. 3 slow notes. Then silence. The mechanism had broken long ago. Still, something about the unfinished melody lingered in the room after it ended. Elena closed the lid gently. A strange sadness touched her then. Not her own sadness exactly. More the feeling of entering the remains of someone else's ordinary happiness. A life interrupted not by tragedy perhaps, but simply by time. Downstairs, a clock chimed softly. 7 o'clock. The sound startled her enough that she laughed quietly at herself. She placed the music box back exactly where she found it and left the room. The kitchen downstairs felt warmer now with daylight filling the windows. Mist drifted low across the lake beyond the glass, moving slowly enough to seem suspended. Elena put water on to boil for tea. As she waited, she wandered through the downstairs more carefully than she had the night before. The living room shelves held dozens of records organized without any clear system. Classical music beside jazz. Folk albums beside old piano recordings. Several sleeves had handwritten notes tucked inside them. Rainy evenings. For the first snow. Play near midnight. She traced one note lightly with her thumb. The handwriting matched the note she found outside in the planter. Elegant and narrow. Whoever had written them seemed to arrange music not by genre, but by feeling. The realization made the room seem even more inhabited. Near the fireplace stood a narrow wooden cabinet she had not noticed before. Inside were board games, candles, old decks of cards, and stacks of folded letters tied carefully with faded ribbon. Elena looked away almost immediately. Those truly felt private. Even untouched. As though the house itself preferred they remain where they were. The kettle began to whistle softly. She made tea and carried the mug onto the porch. The cold air sharpened her senses immediately. Morning at the lake felt almost unreal. Mist hovered just above the water while sunlight slowly filtered through the trees behind the house. Tiny droplets clung to the porch railing like glass beads. Somewhere deeper in the forest, unseen birds called to one another in low intermittent sounds. Elena wrapped both hands around the mug. She realized she had not checked her phone once since arriving. The thought felt oddly freeing. She sat there for a long time watching the mist gradually loosen from the surface of the lake. As it thinned, details emerged slowly from the opposite shoreline. Dark pines. A narrow dock. And eventually, the distant house with the yellow porch light. In daylight it appeared smaller than she expected. Simple and gray beneath tall trees. No movement came from it. No smoke from the chimney. Just stillness. Yet she found herself looking toward it repeatedly, wondering who had played the piano the night before. A sudden sound nearby interrupted her thoughts. Footsteps on gravel. Elena turned. An older man stood near the driveway holding a small paper bag in one hand. He wore a green raincoat despite the clearing weather. His silver beard was damp from morning mist. For a moment neither of them spoke. Then he lifted one hand politely. "You must be the new guest." His voice was gentle, almost careful. Elena stood from the porch chair. "I am." "Elena." The man nodded once. "Graham." He approached slowly, though not fully onto the porch itself. "I brought bread," he said, lifting the bag slightly. "The bakery truck comes Thursdays. Figured you might not have gone into town yet." "That's very kind." He handed her the bag. The bread inside was still warm. A quiet silence followed. Not awkward exactly. More the silence of two people listening to the lake between sentences. Finally Graham glanced toward the water. "Beautiful morning for your first day here." "It is." He nodded again, though his expression shifted faintly then, becoming distant somehow. "You staying long?" "A month, maybe more." Something unreadable crossed his face at that. But it vanished quickly. "Well," he said softly, "the house is good company once you learn its moods." Elena smiled faintly. "Its moods?" A small breath of amusement escaped him. "Old places develop habits." Before she could respond, he looked toward the upstairs windows briefly. Then away again. "Storm coming tomorrow night," he said. "Best bring extra wood inside before evening." "I will." Another silence. Elena sensed there was something else he wanted to say. Instead he adjusted his coat collar. "If you need groceries, town's 20 minutes south. Only one store open past 6. "Thank you." He nodded politely once more and stepped backward toward the driveway. But before leaving entirely, he paused. "The upstairs room," he said carefully, still facing away from her now. "Most people keep that door closed." Elena felt a slight tightening in her chest. "Why?" Graham remained silent for several seconds. Then he shrugged gently. "No reason, really. Just habit around here." And with that, he walked back down the gravel path and disappeared slowly between the trees. Elena stood motionless on the porch long after he left. The bread remained warm in her hands. "Most people keep that door closed." The words lingered unpleasantly. Not because they sounded threatening. Because they sounded sad. She looked back toward the upstairs window of the room she had explored earlier. From outside, it appeared almost hidden beneath overhanging branches. Quiet. Watching the lake. A breeze moved across the water then, carrying faint ripples toward shore for the first time that morning. The mist began dissolving completely. Elena returned inside. The warmth of the kitchen greeted her softly, along with the faint ticking of the clock near the fireplace. She sliced the bread and ate slowly at the counter. Yet even while doing ordinary things, washing the knife, pouring more tea, unpacking groceries from her bag, she kept thinking about the upstairs room. Not fearfully. Emotionally. As though the room contained some unfinished conversation the house itself had never fully released. By late afternoon, the weather shifted again. Clouds gathered low over the lake, turning the water darker. Wind moved through the trees in long whispering waves. Elena spent hours unpacking books, folding clothes into drawers, trying to settle herself into the rhythm of the place. But every room carried traces of another existence. A coat hook beside the door worn smooth by years of use. A single teacup with a repaired crack. Pencils sharpened recently enough to still smell faintly of cedar. The house never felt abandoned. Only paused. As evening approached, Elena lit the fireplace. Flames filled the room with soft orange light. Rain began tapping gently against the windows not long afterward. She sat curled beneath the wool blanket on the sofa while darkness gathered over the lake outside. The storm clouds erased the far shoreline completely. Only her own reflection remained visible in the glass now. At some point she noticed something resting beneath the coffee table. A small wooden box. She leaned forward carefully and pulled it closer. Inside lay dozens of old postcards bundled neatly together. Most showed places around the lake decades earlier. Summer festivals. Frozen docks. Children swimming near the shoreline. One postcard had never been sent. The handwriting on the back matched the narrow, elegant script from the notes. Sometimes I think houses remember us longer than people do. No signature. No address. Elena stared at the sentence while rain whispered steadily against the windows. And for the first time since arriving, she felt certain of something strange. The mystery of the house was not hidden in secrets. It lived inside ordinary things. Inside objects left exactly where someone once loved them. Chapter 3: Small Signs of Another Life. Rain continued through most of the night. Elena listened to it half awake beneath the blankets, drifting in and out of dreams while water moved steadily across the roof above her. Sometimes the wind rose gently through the trees surrounding the house, filling the darkness with soft whispering sounds. Other times the lake became so still that she could hear individual drops falling from the porch railing outside. Near dawn, thunder rolled somewhere far beyond the hills. Not sharp or violent. Just distant enough to feel comforting. When she finally woke fully, pale gray light filled the bedroom. The storm had passed eastward, leaving behind a colder morning. Tiny rivers of rainwater slid down the windows facing the lake. For several moments Elena remained still, listening. The house had its own collection of quiet sounds now, and she was beginning to recognize them. The soft ticking of the downstairs clock. Pipes shifting faintly inside the walls. The occasional creak from the staircase when the air temperature changed. And beneath all of it, always, the lake. Sometimes moving. Sometimes perfectly calm. Always present. She dressed slowly and went downstairs barefoot, one hand sliding lightly along the polished wooden banister. The house smelled different after rain. Cleaner somehow. The scent of damp cedar drifted through the rooms along with faint traces of extinguished fireplace smoke. Morning light reflected softly across the wet porch outside, illuminating tiny puddles gathered between the boards. Elena entered the kitchen and stopped. A single chair had been moved. Only slightly. She stared at it for a moment. Last night she distinctly remembered pushing both chairs fully beneath the small wooden table before going upstairs. Now one remained angled outward as though someone had recently stood from it. A faint chill moved through her arms. Then, almost immediately, she felt embarrassed. Old houses shifted constantly. Wood expanded during storms. Chairs moved easily across uneven floors. Still, she crossed the room more slowly than before. The rest of the kitchen appeared exactly as she left it. The mug drying beside the sink. The bread wrapped carefully in cloth. Her coat hanging near the back door. Nothing unusual. And yet the feeling lingered. Not fear. Awareness. As though the house possessed tiny movements of its own when left alone. She made coffee and carried it toward the living room windows. Outside, the lake looked transformed. Yesterday's mist had vanished completely. The water stretched dark and glassy beneath moving clouds while sunlight broke through in pale shifting columns. Across the lake, the distant gray house appeared clearer now between the trees. And for the first time, she saw someone. A figure standing near the dock. Too far away to distinguish clearly. They remained motionless for several seconds, facing the water. Then disappeared back into the trees. Elena continued staring long afterward. The sight should have made the lake feel less isolated. Instead, it deepened the strange emotional atmosphere surrounding the place. Everyone here seemed to move quietly, almost carefully, as though loud lives did not belong beside the water. She spent the morning exploring outdoors. The rain had darkened the shoreline stones into shades of charcoal and silver. Moss glowed vividly along the path leading around the side of the house. Fallen pine needles released a rich earthy scent beneath her boots. Near the woodshed behind the garage, Elena discovered a row of old gardening tools hanging neatly against the wall. A rake. 2 shovels. A rusted watering can. And beside them, a pair of faded yellow rain boots. She paused. The boots were small. Not a child's size exactly, but narrow and short. Mud still clung faintly around the soles as though they had last been used only weeks earlier. Yet according to the owner's messages, the house had remained empty for nearly 2 months before her arrival. Elena crouched slightly, studying them. One lace remained untied. Again the same feeling returned. Not abandonment. Interruption. The sensation that ordinary routines had simply paused one afternoon and never fully resumed. A breeze moved through the trees overhead. Somewhere deeper in the woods, branches knocked together softly. Elena stood again and carried several logs toward the porch for the coming storm Graham had mentioned. By the time she finished, clouds had begun thickening once more over the lake. She decided to drive into town before weather worsened again. The road looked different in daylight. Less mysterious than the previous evening, though no less isolated. Wet leaves clung to the gravel edges while fog lingered low between distant trees. Elena passed the narrow bridge slowly, glancing again toward the pale yellow house visible through branches on the opposite shore. No lights now. No movement. only stillness beneath the clouds. The town itself consisted of little more than a few quiet streets near the marina. A grocery store. A bookstore. 2 cafes. A gas station. A diner overlooking the water. Everything appeared softened by weather and time. Even the people moved differently here. Without hurry. Without phones pressed constantly to their ears or tense expressions fixed toward invisible schedules. Elena parked near the bookstore first. A brass bell rang softly when she entered. The warmth inside immediately fogged her glasses. Books filled every wall from floor to ceiling. Lamps cast amber pools of light across worn wooden floors. Somewhere near the back, quiet jazz played from unseen speakers. An older woman looked up from behind the counter. "You're staying at the lake house," she said before Elena spoke. Not a question. Elena smiled faintly. "Is it that obvious? In a town this small?" "Yes." The woman's expression remained kind but thoughtful. She wore silver rings on nearly every finger and a thick gray sweater despite the warmth indoors. "I'm Marianne," she said. "Elena." Marianne nodded toward the weather outside. "Storm pushed everyone indoors today. Good day for books." Elena wandered the shelves slowly while they spoke intermittently. Local history sections occupied one corner beside collections of poetry and regional photography books. Near the register, she noticed a framed photograph pinned beside handwritten notes about community events. The photograph showed the lake during winter. And standing near the shoreline? The same woman from the porch photograph inside the house. Elena stopped completely. Though younger here, the woman's posture was unmistakable. The same dark hair. The same calm stillness in the way she faced the water. Marianne noticed her attention immediately. That was Evelyn. Elena glanced toward her. She lived in the house? For many years. Something softened in Marianne's voice then. She loved that lake more than anyone I've known. Elena studied the photograph again. Did she leave recently? A brief silence settled between them. Marianne adjusted a stack of books carefully before answering. No. Not recently. The words carried a quiet finality Elena immediately understood. "Oh," she said softly. Marianne nodded once. "She passed away last winter." Elena looked back at the photograph. Suddenly many things inside the house rearranged themselves in her mind. The open poetry book. The handwritten notes. The preserved upstairs room. Not forgotten objects. Memories left exactly where someone once placed them. She had no family nearby? Elena asked gently. "A nephew handles the property now. Lives overseas most of the year." Marianne hesitated briefly. The house stayed untouched for a long time after she died. Untouched. The word settled heavily inside Elena. Not cleaned out. Not emptied. Untouched. As though the town itself had quietly agreed not to disturb the life Evelyn left behind. Marianne walked closer beside her. "She used to come here every Thursday morning," she said. "Always bought poetry and those terrible orange candies no one else liked." A faint smile appeared. Sometimes she'd sit by the window for hours during storms without reading a single page. Elena imagined it suddenly with surprising clarity. The woman from the photograph sitting quietly beside rain-covered glass while the lake darkened outside. Alone. But perhaps not lonely. What was she like? Elena asked. Marianne considered the question carefully. Quiet in a way that made other people quieter too. The answer lingered in the warm bookstore air. Before leaving, Elena bought 2 novels and a small notebook she did not need. As Marianne wrapped them in paper, she said softly, "Some people come to the lake to disappear from things." Elena looked up. And others? Marianne tied the string neatly around the package. Others come because they hope silence might return something to them. Outside, rain had begun again. Not heavy. Just a fine steady drizzle blurring the marina and rooftops into watercolor shapes. Elena spent another hour wandering town before returning to the house near dusk. The lake looked darker now beneath the storm clouds. Wind moved visibly across the water in long silver ripples. By the time she reached the porch, rain soaked the shoulders of her coat. Inside, warmth greeted her immediately. And once again she paused. Music floated faintly through the living room. A piano recording. Slow and delicate. Elena stared toward the record player. It was spinning. She crossed the room carefully. One of the vinyl records she had examined yesterday now rested on the turntable. She was absolutely certain she had not touched it. The music itself felt hauntingly intimate, not because it was sad, but because it sounded homemade somehow. Slight imperfections in timing. The faint creak of piano pedals in the background. A private recording. She lifted the needle gently. Silence returned instantly. For several seconds she simply stood there holding the edge of the cabinet. Then she noticed the note tucked inside the record sleeve. For evenings when the rain stays longer than expected. The same elegant handwriting. Elena sat slowly on the sofa. The rational part of her mind explained everything easily enough. Perhaps the owner had prepared the house intentionally this way for guests, leaving records and notes to create atmosphere. Yet none of it felt curated. It felt personal. As though Evelyn herself had once moved naturally through these rooms, leaving small emotional markers behind without imagining strangers would later discover them. Outside, rain tapped steadily against the windows again. Darkness settled early beneath the storm. Elena lit the fireplace and made tea. The house glowed warmly around her while wind moved through the trees outside in soft, restless waves. For the first time in months, she realized she had spent an entire day without thinking about the city she left behind. Without replaying old conversations. Without checking messages she no longer wished to receive. The realization unsettled her slightly. Healing, she thought, was perhaps quieter than people expected. Not dramatic transformations. Just small spaces opening inside the mind where pain no longer occupied every room. Later that evening, unable to resist curiosity any longer, Elena returned upstairs to the preserved room at the end of the hallway. Rain whispered softly against the windows as she entered. The room felt dimmer at night, more enclosed by memory. She approached the desk again. This time she opened one of the notebooks. Inside were not diary entries, but observations. Short paragraphs written over many years. The lake froze earlier this winter than expected. The birds arrived before sunrise today. Rain sounds different in October than in March. Elena turned pages slowly. Most entries focused on ordinary things. Weather. Light. The changing moods of the water. But occasionally a sentence appeared that felt startlingly intimate. Some loneliness becomes familiar enough that you carry it gently. Or, there are evenings when silence feels less empty than company. Elena sat carefully in the desk chair. The handwriting remained calm throughout every page. No anger. No bitterness. Just quiet attention to life unfolding around the lake. Then, near the center of the notebook, she found a loose photograph tucked between pages. A man stood beside the porch railing smiling toward the camera. Tall. Dark-haired. Wearing a wool coat. Behind him, younger Evelyn laughed at something outside the frame. Elena stared at the image for a long moment. The photograph radiated warmth. Not posed happiness. Real affection. She turned it over carefully. Summer 1992. No other explanation. Rain deepened outside. The room darkened further as clouds swallowed the last traces of evening light. Elena suddenly understood something she had not fully realized before. The mystery of the house was not about discovering what happened here. It was about understanding what remained. Not objects. Not rooms. But emotional residue. The invisible shape of a life deeply lived within these walls. Downstairs, the clock chimed softly again. 9 times. Elena closed the notebook gently. And somewhere across the dark water beyond the rain-covered windows, faint piano music began once more. Chapter 4: The Neighbor Who Knew Something. The piano music continued long after Elena returned downstairs. Soft notes drifted across the lake through rain and darkness, sometimes nearly disappearing beneath the wind before rising again. She stood beside the living room windows listening without moving, one hand resting lightly against the cold glass. The melody was different from the night before. Slower. More hesitant. As though the person playing had paused often between thoughts. Outside, rain silvered the porch railing and blurred the shoreline into shifting shadows. The distant yellow light across the lake glowed faintly through the storm. Elena wondered what it must feel like to live alone out there. To sit at a piano beside dark water night after night while weather moved endlessly across the lake. The thought should have felt lonely. Instead, it seemed strangely peaceful. She made soup from the groceries she had bought in town and ate slowly at the kitchen counter while listening to the rain. The warmth of the house settled around her differently now that she knew Evelyn's name. Everything had become more personal. The notes tucked into record sleeves. The careful arrangement of books. The notebooks upstairs filled with quiet observations. Even the repaired crack in the teacup beside the sink now felt meaningful rather than accidental. Someone had loved these rooms deeply enough to repair things instead of replacing them. After dinner, Elena carried another log to the fireplace and curled beneath the wool blanket again. The storm outside strengthened gradually through the evening. Branches brushed softly against the roof while waves began breaking harder against the shoreline below. Still, the house never felt fragile. It held the weather calmly. Like something long accustomed to storms. At some point, without fully deciding to, Elena opened one of the notebooks she had brought downstairs from the upstairs room. Rain sounds different in October than in March. She reread the lines slowly. The notebooks fascinated her because they revealed so little and so much at once. Evelyn rarely wrote directly about herself. Instead, she described weather, birds, changing light, distant boats crossing the lake. Yet between those observations lived an entire emotional world. Elena turned another page. There are people who speak because they fear silence, and people who learn silence can answer back. She stared at the sentence while thunder rolled faintly far across the hills. Then she closed the notebook. It suddenly felt too intimate to keep reading. As though she were overhearing thoughts never meant for strangers. Before bed she stepped briefly onto the porch. Cold wind immediately wrapped around her. Rain had weakened into mist now, drifting sideways across the lake in pale sheets. The distant house remained lit, though the piano music had stopped. The yellow glow across the water looked comforting tonight rather than mysterious. Like proof that another quiet life existed nearby. Elena remained outside only a minute before returning indoors. The house smelled warmly of cedar and rain-damp clothing drying near the fire. Upstairs, the bedroom felt softer somehow after the storm. She fell asleep quickly beneath heavy blankets while wind moved steadily through the trees. And for the first time in many months, she dreamed peacefully. The next morning arrived clear and cold. Sunlight spilled across the lake in brilliant silver reflections while mist lifted slowly from the shoreline. Elena woke later than usual, surprised by how deeply she had slept. Downstairs, the house glowed with fresh morning light. She opened several windows while making coffee, letting cold air and birdsong drift through the rooms. Somewhere nearby, unseen geese called across the water. The storm had washed everything clean. Pine needles shone dark green with moisture. Tiny drops of water clung to spider webs beneath the porch railing. Even the sky seemed larger after rain. Elena spent most of the morning reading near the windows. Hours passed quietly. Sometimes she looked up from her book simply to watch light moving across the lake. Other times she found herself listening unconsciously for the distant piano, though none came during daylight. Around noon, she decided to walk farther along the shoreline path behind the house. The trail curved through dense trees where sunlight filtered softly between branches. Moss covered fallen logs in thick emerald layers. Somewhere deeper in the woods, water trickled faintly over stones. The farther she walked, the more isolated the house began to feel behind her. Yet the isolation no longer frightened her. It felt protective. As though the lake existed slightly outside ordinary time. After nearly 20 minutes, the path widened unexpectedly near a small clearing overlooking the water. A bench stood there beneath two tall birch trees. Old but carefully maintained. Elena sat for a while listening to waves touch the rocks below. From here she could see farther down the shoreline than from the house itself. And farther across the lake. The gray house with the yellow porch light appeared more clearly visible now between the trees opposite her. A narrow dock extended into the water. Wind chimes moved faintly near the porch. Then she noticed someone standing near the shore. A man. He wore a dark sweater and remained motionless for several moments before slowly lifting one hand in greeting across the water. Elena hesitated, then waved back. The distance between them was too great for conversation, yet something about the exchange felt unexpectedly intimate. Two strangers acknowledging each other's solitude. After a few moments, the man disappeared back toward the house. Elena remained seated longer than intended. The lake carried a strange emotional gravity. Time moved differently beside it. Thoughts slowed. Memories surfaced unexpectedly. She found herself thinking about her apartment in the city and how impossible silence had once seemed there. Every room had carried noise from neighboring walls, traffic below, endless screens and voices demanding attention. Here, even loneliness felt softer. More honest somehow. When she finally returned to the house later that afternoon, a truck was parked near the driveway. Graham stood beside it unloading firewood. "Oh," Elena said, surprised. "You didn't have to do that." "Storm split some trees near my property," he replied. "Figured you could use the extra wood." Together they carried logs toward the woodshed while sunlight faded slowly through the trees. Up close, Graham seemed older than she first realized. Deep lines marked the corners of his eyes, though his movements remained steady and careful. For a while neither spoke much. Then Graham glanced toward the lake. "You hear the piano again last night?" Elena looked at him sharply. "You could hear it from your place?" "Most nights, if the wind's right." Something in his tone suggested the music had become part of the landscape long ago. "Who lives over there?" she asked carefully. Graham stacked another log before answering. "His name's Arthur." Elena repeated it quietly. "Does he live alone?" "Yes." The conversation paused there. But Graham seemed thoughtful now, distracted by memories of his own. Finally he said, "Arthur knew Evelyn a long time." The words settled gently between them. Elena leaned against the woodshed doorway. "People in town still talk about her." They would. A faint smile appeared beneath Graham's beard. She was the kind of person who listened carefully. "Folks remember that." Elena hesitated. "The house still feels like hers." Graham nodded immediately, almost relieved she understood. "Some places hold on to people." His gaze drifted toward the upstairs windows briefly. After she passed, nobody came near the property for months. Couldn't bring themselves to change anything. Why not? Graham considered the question quietly. Then he said, "Because it already felt complete." The answer lingered inside Elena long after. Complete. Not unfinished. Not tragic. Simply full of someone's presence. They carried the last armful of wood inside as evening shadows deepened across the lake. Before leaving, Graham paused near the porch steps. "You ever meet someone," he said slowly, "who makes a place feel more alive just by being there?" Elena thought of the notebooks upstairs. The handwritten notes. The repaired teacup. "Yes," she answered softly. "That was Evelyn." For a moment Graham looked toward the water with an expression Elena could not fully read. Not grief exactly. More the quiet ache of remembering someone kind. Then he nodded once and headed back toward his truck. As the engine disappeared through the trees, silence returned once more. But now the silence felt inhabited by stories. That evening the sky cleared completely. Sunset spread across the lake in long ribbons of amber and pale violet. Elena ate dinner on the porch wrapped in a blanket while cold air settled gradually over the shoreline. Across the water, the yellow porch light flickered on again. A few minutes later, piano music drifted faintly over the lake. She listened more carefully tonight. The melodies carried a sadness that wasn't painful, only reflective. Like someone turning old memories over gently in their hands. Without fully deciding to, Elena walked down toward the dock below the house. The boards creaked softly beneath her weight. Water moved quietly around the posts while stars slowly appeared overhead. The music continued. And suddenly she realized something strange. The songs sounded familiar. Not because she recognized the melodies themselves. Because they felt connected somehow to the emotional atmosphere inside the house. The same softness. The same patience. The same quiet longing. As though both the house and the distant piano belonged to the same unfinished conversation. Elena sat at the end of the dock with her knees drawn close against the cold. Far across the lake, Arthur's porch light glowed steadily through darkness. She imagined him there alone beside the piano, unaware someone was listening from the opposite shore. Then another thought came quietly. Perhaps he knew. Perhaps the music itself was a kind of remembering. The lake reflected moonlight now in slow trembling patterns. Trees along the shoreline became dark silhouettes against the sky. And sitting there surrounded by water and silence, Elena felt something inside herself loosening at last. Not disappearing. Just softening enough to breathe around. Behind her, the house waited warmly among the trees. Ahead of her, the piano continued across the dark lake like a voice refusing to entirely fade away. Chapter 5: The Room Upstairs. The next morning arrived with fog so dense that the lake disappeared completely. When Elena stepped onto the porch with her coffee, the world beyond the railing had dissolved into pale white silence. Even the shoreline below the house was barely visible. The water and sky blended together seamlessly until it felt as though the house floated alone inside a cloud. The air smelled cold and mineral-rich after the rain. Somewhere unseen, a loon called across the lake. The sound echoed through the fog with a strange loneliness that lingered long after it ended. Elena wrapped both hands around the warm mug and listened. Since arriving at the lake, she had begun noticing sounds differently. In the city, noise existed in layers so constant that individual details disappeared inside them. Here, every small thing carried weight. The creak of branches. The shifting water. A distant bird. Wind beneath the porch roof. Even silence itself seemed textured. She stood outside until the coffee cooled, watching mist move slowly through the trees around the house. The fog softened everything it touched. Pine branches became blurred silhouettes. The dock below emerged and vanished again in shifting white. And across the lake, Arthur's house was gone entirely. The absence unsettled her more than she expected. Over the past few evenings, the distant yellow light and piano music had quietly become part of the rhythm of the lake. Without them, the morning felt emptier. Back inside, warmth settled around her immediately. The fire from last night had faded into pale gray ash. Elena knelt beside the hearth and rebuilt it carefully, arranging fresh logs while faint smoke scented the room. As flames slowly caught, she found herself thinking again about the upstairs room. Most people keep that door closed. Graham's words had remained with her. Not because they sounded ominous, but because they carried emotional caution. As though the room contained something fragile. The fire crackled softly behind her. Outside, fog pressed gently against the windows. And somewhere inside the house, she felt the quiet pull of curiosity once more. By late morning, unable to resist it any longer, Elena carried one of Evelyn's notebooks upstairs and returned to the room at the end of the hallway. Daylight filtered weakly through the mist outside, filling the space with pale silver light. Dust drifted slowly near the bookshelves. The narrow bed remained perfectly made, the knitted blanket folded with careful precision. The room felt waiting. Not abandoned. Waiting. Elena crossed toward the desk. Yesterday she had only skimmed portions of the notebooks before emotion and hesitation stopped her. Today, however, the room itself felt different, less like an intrusion and more like an invitation to understand something. She sat carefully in the wooden chair. The surface of the desk bore faint scratches from years of use. Near the corner sat a ceramic bowl filled with smooth beach stones gathered from the shoreline below. Several had words painted onto them in fading white ink. November. Patience. Stay. Elena touched one gently. The handwriting matched Evelyn's. Beside the bowl rested another photograph she had not noticed before. Smaller than the others. Slightly bent at one corner. This one showed Evelyn much older than in the earlier photographs downstairs. Her dark hair had gone silver. She sat on the porch wrapped in a heavy sweater, holding a mug with both hands while looking toward the lake. The camera had caught her mid-laugh. Whoever took the picture clearly loved her. That realization carried no sharp sadness. Only warmth. Elena studied the image for several quiet moments before placing it back exactly where she found it. Then she opened another notebook. The pages were dated irregularly across many years. January 4th. The lake froze during the night. Arthur says the ice always speaks first before dawn. He's right. March 12th. I dreamed of the garden again. Strange how memory rearranges places we once knew well. April 29th. There are evenings when the light across the water feels closer than the shore itself. Elena paused. Arthur. The name appeared naturally inside the entries, without explanation. As though no explanation had ever been necessary. She continued reading slowly. June 8th. Storm rolled in before sunset. We listened to records until midnight with the windows open. September 17th. He played the piano tonight while fog moved across the lake. I could hear every note from the dock. Elena leaned back slightly. The room suddenly felt fuller. Not with ghosts or haunting. With relationship. The notebooks revealed something intimate and deeply quiet between Evelyn and Arthur. Not dramatic romance. Not grand declarations. Companionship. Years of shared silence across the water. Elena imagined them on opposite shores listening for each other's music at night. The thought moved her unexpectedly. Outside, wind shifted softly through the trees. The fog beyond the windows began thinning at last, revealing faint outlines of water below. Elena turned another page. December 2nd. Some people believe loneliness comes from being alone too long. I think loneliness comes from being unseen. The sentence stayed with her. She stared at it while the room settled softly around her. Unseen. The word touched something tender inside her chest. For months before coming to the lake, Elena had felt strangely invisible within her own life. Not literally unseen, of course. She spoke to coworkers every day. Answered messages. Sat in crowded cafes surrounded by people. Yet somewhere along the way, she had stopped feeling truly present to anyone. Or perhaps to herself. The realization arrived quietly enough to almost escape notice. She closed the notebook gently. The fog outside continued lifting in pale drifting ribbons now. Through the window she could finally see portions of the lake reappearing below the cliffs. And across the room, near the bookshelf, something caught her attention. A narrow wooden door partially hidden behind hanging coats. Elena frowned slightly. She had not noticed it before. The coats concealed most of the frame, making the door blend naturally into the wall. She stood slowly and crossed toward it. The handle was old brass worn smooth by use. For a moment she hesitated. Then she opened it carefully. Cold air drifted outward immediately. Inside was not another room, but a small attic space beneath the roof. The ceiling sloped sharply overhead. Dust scented the air. Narrow windows overlooked the lake through weathered glass. Boxes lined the walls. Old furniture rested beneath white sheets. And near the far corner stood a piano. Elena stopped completely. The instrument was upright, dark wood faded with age. Several candles rested on top beside stacks of sheet music tied carefully with ribbon. Slowly she approached. A layer of dust covered the keys except for a small section near the center, as though someone had touched them more recently than the rest. The realization sent a faint shiver through her arms. She sat carefully on the bench. The wood creaked softly beneath her weight. For several moments she simply looked at the piano. Then, almost without thinking, she pressed one key gently. A low note echoed through the attic. Softer than expected. Sadder somehow. The sound lingered in the rafters long after it faded. Elena rested her fingers lightly above the keys but did not play further. She had taken piano lessons briefly as a child before quitting. Yet sitting there now beside the narrow attic windows, she suddenly remembered forgotten details with startling clarity. Dust floating through afternoon sunlight. The smell of old sheet music. Her mother humming softly from the kitchen while Elena practiced scales downstairs. Memory moved strangely in quiet places. The attic itself felt deeply personal. More private even than the room downstairs. The boxes surrounding the piano carried handwritten labels in Evelyn's narrow script. Winter clothes. Garden journals. Letters. One simply read, Arthur. Elena looked away immediately. The intimacy of it felt too great. Instead, she studied the sheet music resting atop the piano. Most pages had yellowed with age. Several carried handwritten notes in the margins. Too slow here. Again from beginning. Rainy evenings. Rainy evenings. The phrase appeared repeatedly throughout the house. As though music and weather had become inseparable parts of Evelyn's life. A breeze moved against the attic windows suddenly, rattling them softly. Elena stood and crossed toward the glass. The fog had nearly vanished now. The lake stretched below in muted silver blue beneath moving clouds. And across the water, Arthur's house. Visible once more between the trees. Even from this distance she could see the dock clearly now. Wind chimes moved faintly near the porch roof. Then she noticed something else. A small boat drifting slowly away from the opposite shoreline. Arthur sat inside it alone. He rowed steadily through the pale morning light without apparent destination, moving parallel to the shore while mist trailed softly behind him. Elena remained motionless at the window watching until the boat disappeared farther down the lake. The sight filled her with an odd calm. Everything here seemed to exist at gentler speeds. Nothing hurried. Nothing demanded. Even grief, perhaps, had softened over time into quiet ritual. Eventually she left the attic and returned downstairs carrying one of the music books she found near the piano. The house felt warmer now with afternoon sunlight finally entering through the windows. Dust motes floated lazily above the floors. The fire crackled steadily in the hearth. Elena made tea and settled near the living room windows again. The music book rested unopened in her lap for nearly an hour before curiosity overcame hesitation. Inside were handwritten compositions. Simple piano pieces dated across decades. Some carried titles. First Snowfall. Lake Before Sunrise. October Rain. Others remained untitled entirely. Near the back she found one page folded carefully inward. The handwriting there differed slightly from Evelyn's, broader, less precise. 4E. So you'll always know which light is mine. Below the message, a short melody had been written across the staff. Elena stared at the page quietly. The emotional tenderness between Arthur and Evelyn seemed woven invisibly through every room of the house. Not loud or dramatic love. Something quieter. Enduring. The kind built slowly through years of shared routines and silences. She imagined Evelyn hearing the distant piano across dark water night after night, always recognizing which light belonged to him. Outside, clouds broke apart gradually through the afternoon. Sunlight moved in long bright patterns across the lake. Elena spent hours reading near the windows while the house settled around her. Yet something had shifted now. The mystery no longer felt centered on Evelyn alone. Arthur remained part of it too. Not hidden deliberately, but present everywhere in small traces. The music. The photographs. The notebook entries. The attic piano. By evening, the sky cleared fully. Cold blue twilight spread across the water while the first stars appeared overhead. Elena lit candles throughout the downstairs rooms and cooked dinner slowly while jazz played softly from the record player. The house no longer felt unfamiliar. It felt inhabited by memory in a way that comforted rather than disturbed her. After dinner she carried a blanket onto the porch. Night settled gently across the lake. One by one, distant lights appeared along the far shoreline. And then Arthur's porch lamp glowed warm gold through the darkness. Only minutes later, piano music drifted once more across the water. Tonight the melody sounded different. Lighter. Almost hopeful. Elena closed her eyes and listened. Somewhere upstairs above her, the hidden attic piano waited silently beneath the roof. Somewhere across the lake, Arthur played into the darkness alone. And between them stretched years of memory held quietly by water, music, and the old house at the end of the lake. Chapter 6: The Woman Who Lived There Before. For the first time since arriving at the lake, Elena dreamed about Evelyn. Not clearly. The dream carried the soft, uncertain quality of old film. Fragments of movement. Light across water. The sound of piano drifting through open windows. In the dream, Evelyn stood on the dock at dusk wearing the heavy gray sweater from the photograph upstairs. Wind moved through her silver hair while she watched the far shoreline in silence. Then she turned slightly, as though sensing someone behind her. Not frightened. Simply aware. Before Elena could see her face fully, the dream dissolved. She woke slowly to pale morning light and the sound of rain beginning again. The bedroom windows had fogged at the edges overnight. Outside, the lake stretched dark and motionless beneath low clouds. Rain touched the water so gently it barely disturbed the surface. Elena remained beneath the blankets for several moments listening to it. The dream lingered with unusual clarity. Not because it felt supernatural. It didn't. Rather, Evelyn had begun occupying space inside Elena's imagination the way real people do after hearing enough stories about them. The photographs, notebooks, music, and traces throughout the house had gradually formed a living emotional presence. Not haunting. Memory. A life continuing softly inside the objects and routines left behind. Downstairs, the house smelled faintly of cedar smoke and yesterday's tea leaves. Elena padded barefoot into the kitchen while rain whispered steadily against the windows. The mornings had become her favorite part of the day here. Everything felt slower before noon. Even time itself seemed softened by the lake. She filled the kettle and stood beside the counter watching rain drift across the shoreline. Somewhere out in the fog, unseen birds called intermittently through the mist. Then she noticed something unusual near the back door. An umbrella rested against the wall. Dark blue. Wooden handle. Still damp with rainwater. Elena frowned slightly. She stared at it for several long seconds before memory returned. The umbrella had been hanging upstairs near the attic door yesterday afternoon. She was certain of it. A strange feeling moved through her chest again. Not fear. Never fear. Only the unsettling sensation that the house rearranged itself in small quiet ways when she wasn't paying attention. She crossed toward the umbrella slowly and touched the handle. Cold. Perhaps she carried it downstairs absent-mindedly last night and forgot. The explanation felt reasonable enough, though something inside her resisted it. The kettle began to whistle softly. Elena made tea and lit the fireplace while rain deepened outside. Gray light filled the rooms without ever fully brightening them. The weather wrapped the house in calm isolation once more. Around mid-morning she decided to continue exploring the attic space. Not searching for secrets exactly. More listening. The house revealed itself slowly, piece by piece, and she had begun trusting that rhythm. Upstairs, the preserved room looked dimmer beneath the storm clouds. The hidden attic door stood partially open from yesterday. Elena climbed carefully into the narrow space beneath the roof. Rain tapped softly against the slanted windows overhead. The attic smelled of dust, paper, and old wood warmed by years of summer heat. The piano remained where she left it, silent beside the stacks of boxes and sheet music. Today, however, her attention drifted toward a low bookshelf near the far wall. Photo albums lined the bottom shelf. Several dozen at least. Their fabric covers had faded with age into muted shades of blue and green. Elena hesitated before lifting the first one. The earliest photographs showed the house decades earlier. Summer gardens blooming wildly along the porch. Snow buried halfway up the windows during winter storms. Young Evelyn sitting barefoot on the dock reading beneath afternoon sunlight. The images carried remarkable tenderness. Not polished photography. Ordinary life carefully noticed. As Elena turned pages slowly, years unfolded around the lake. Evelyn gardening beside the shoreline in oversized rain boots. Arthur helping repair the dock during autumn while leaves drifted across the water behind him. Evenings around the fireplace with records scattered across the floor. Birthday cakes. Foggy mornings. Lanterns glowing during snowstorms. The more Elena looked, the clearer something became. Evelyn and Arthur had not simply lived near one another. Their lives had intertwined quietly across decades. Not through dramatic moments, but through accumulation. Shared weather. Shared silence. Shared years. One photograph held Elena's attention longer than the others. Arthur stood in the kitchen holding a loaf of bread while laughing toward someone behind the camera. Morning sunlight flooded the room around him. Through the window, rain streaked the glass. The expression on his face startled her. Open. Warm. Entirely unguarded. Beneath the photo, Evelyn had written in small careful letters. Stormbread. October 1998. Stormbread. Elena smiled faintly. The phrase felt deeply specific in the way long relationships often develop private languages around ordinary things. She turned another page. Then another. Gradually the photographs shifted. Evelyn's hair silvered. Arthur's face grew thinner. The seasons repeated themselves around them endlessly. Yet even in later years, the emotional atmosphere remained unchanged. Gentleness. That was the word that kept returning to Elena. The entire house seemed built from it. A sudden sound downstairs interrupted her thoughts. 3 soft knocks at the front door. Elena closed the album carefully and went downstairs. Rain drifted heavily outside now, blurring the trees into watercolor shadows. When she opened the door, Marianne stood beneath a dark umbrella holding a paper bag against her chest. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said. "Not at all." Marianne stepped inside gratefully, brushing rainwater from her coat sleeves. The warmth of the fire immediately softened the sharpness in her expression. "I brought soup," she explained. "Terrible weather for driving into town." "That's very kind." Marianne glanced around the living room quietly while Elena took the bag into the kitchen. "You've settled in," she observed softly. Elena looked toward her. "I think I have." Marianne nodded once, though her gaze lingered briefly on the notebooks stacked near the fireplace. "You've been reading Evelyn's journals." It wasn't accusation. Just recognition. "A little," Elena admitted carefully. "I hope that's all right." Marianne removed her gloves slowly. "If the house wanted them hidden, you wouldn't have found them." The answer surprised Elena enough to laugh softly. Marianne smiled faintly too. Rain filled the brief silence between them. Finally Elena asked, "What was Evelyn really like?" Marianne's expression changed then, not sad exactly, but distant with memory. She noticed things most people hurried past. She moved toward the windows overlooking the lake. First snow. Birdsong. Which trees changed color earliest in autumn? A small smile touched her mouth. She remembered tiny details about everyone too. The kind that made you feel carefully seen. Elena thought again of the notebook sentence. Loneliness comes from being unseen. She and Arthur were close, Elena said gently. Marianne looked out toward the hidden shoreline beyond the rain. Yes. Only that. But the word carried decades inside it. Elena waited. After a moment Marianne continued quietly. They met here when they were young. Arthur rented the house across the lake every summer with his parents. Her smile deepened faintly. Evelyn used to pretend she didn't notice him watching her from the dock. Rain tapped softly against the windows. They married? Elena asked. Marianne shook her head slowly. No. The answer surprised her. But they stayed here all those years? Yes. Marianne folded her gloves carefully between her hands. Life became complicated. Arthur moved away for a long time. Evelyn stayed. She glanced toward the fire. People assume love only matters if it becomes permanent in the usual ways. They forget some connections survive perfectly well without belonging to anyone. The room fell quiet again. Elena sensed there was much more to the story, yet Marianne spoke with the gentle boundaries of someone protecting memories rather than hiding secrets. What brought him back? Elena asked eventually. Marianne looked toward the lake once more. Evelyn got sick. The words settled softly into the room. Outside, rain deepened against the roof. He returned 3 winters ago, Marianne continued. Stayed across the lake after that. Elena imagined Arthur rowing through foggy mornings. Playing piano at night while lights glowed between the trees. He was with her when she died? Marianne nodded. Yes. No dramatic sorrow entered her voice. Only tenderness. The kind that arrives after grief has lived quietly beside someone for long enough to soften. They ate soup together near the fireplace while afternoon darkened slowly around the house. Marianne told stories then. Small ones. Evelyn leaving books anonymously on neighbors' porches during winter. Arthur repairing everyone's docks each spring without being asked. Long dinners during storms when the power went out across the lake and people gathered here by candlelight. Listening to her, Elena realized the mystery she'd felt since arriving did not come from secrecy. It came from emotional presence. The house carried the shape of 2 people who had loved each other carefully for most of their lives. Not loudly. Not possessively. Just steadily. Before leaving, Marianne paused near the front door. She would have liked you, she said unexpectedly. Elena blinked slightly. You think so? Marianne smiled. You listened to the house instead of trying to change it. Then she opened the umbrella and disappeared into the rain. By evening the storm finally weakened. Clouds drifted apart slowly, revealing pale strips of sunset across the water. Elena walked down to the dock wrapped in a heavy sweater while cool wind moved over the lake. Everything smelled washed clean. Rainwater dripped softly from the pine branches overhead. Across the lake, Arthur's porch light flickered on as darkness gathered. Moments later, piano music drifted faintly through the evening air. Tonight the melody sounded lower, slower. Older somehow. Elena sat cross-legged at the end of the dock listening while twilight deepened around her. She tried imagining Evelyn hearing this same music year after year from the very same place. Summer nights filled with fireflies. Winter storms rattling the shoreline. Fog swallowing the lake entirely. And always, somewhere across the water, Arthur playing piano into the darkness. The thought carried such profound tenderness that it almost hurt. Not because the story was tragic. Because it was real. Most lives, Elena realized, were built not from dramatic moments but from repetition. Shared rituals. Familiar lights in distant windows. The certainty that somewhere nearby existed a person who understood the rhythm of your silence. The piano continued. Water shifted softly beneath the dock. And for the first time since arriving, Elena felt the ache inside herself begin to change shape. Not disappearing, but unfolding. As though the lake and the old house holding decades of memory inside its walls were slowly teaching her something about loneliness she had never understood before. Across the darkening water, Arthur's music rose gently into the night. And behind her, warm light glowed from the windows of the house Evelyn once called home. Chapter 7: What Was Left Behind. The weather turned warmer over the next few days. Not truly warm yet, spring still lingered uncertainly around the lake, but enough for the mornings to lose their sharp edge. The snow lingering in shaded parts of the forest finally disappeared. Sunlight stayed longer across the water each evening. And gradually, almost without noticing, Elena slipped into the rhythm of the house. She woke early now. Made tea while dawn spread silver light across the lake. Read near the windows. Walked the shoreline trails in the afternoons. At night she listened for Arthur's piano drifting over the dark water like part of the weather itself. The city had begun feeling impossibly far away. Sometimes she went entire days without thinking about it. The realization both comforted and unsettled her. On Thursday morning she drove into town again. The roads were damp from overnight rain, and fog hovered low above the marina when she arrived. Fishermen moved quietly along the docks preparing boats while gulls circled overhead in pale gray skies. Inside the bookstore, Marianne greeted her with familiar warmth. "You're becoming local," she said lightly while ringing up Elena's tea purchase. "I'm not sure about that." Marianne smiled faintly. "That's how it starts." The store smelled of old paper and coffee. Rain tapped softly against the front windows while soft jazz played somewhere deeper among the shelves. Elena wandered toward the local history section again almost unconsciously. This time Marianne followed. "You're looking for Evelyn," she observed gently. Elena glanced at her. "Is it obvious?" "A little." There was no judgment in her voice. Only understanding. Marianne reached toward a lower shelf and removed a thin hardcover book bound in faded green cloth. "Here." Elena accepted it carefully. "The Lake in Winter." The cover displayed an old black and white photograph of the shoreline beneath snow. "She wrote this?" Elena asked. Marianne nodded. "Self-published years ago. Hardly anyone outside town ever read it." Elena opened the book slowly. Inside were essays. Observations about seasons, weather, memory, and life beside the lake. Several pages contained sketches of trees and shoreline plants drawn in delicate pencil lines. One passage caught her immediately. "There are places that ask very little of us except attention. The lake has always been one of them." Elena looked up. She was a writer? In her own way. Marianne leaned lightly against the shelf. "She taught literature at the university once. Long ago." The detail startled Elena. Until now, Evelyn had existed mostly as emotional atmosphere, a woman in photographs, notebooks, and fading memories. Suddenly she became larger, more dimensional. A real life beyond the lake. "What made her stay here?" Elena asked softly. Marianne's gaze drifted toward the rain-covered windows. "I think the lake became home before she realized it." The answer lingered quietly. Before leaving the bookstore, Elena bought the book. Marianne wrapped it carefully in brown paper. At the door, she paused. "There's something else," she said. Elena waited. Evelyn used to keep letters. A strange feeling moved through Elena immediately. "Letters?" Marianne nodded slowly. "Boxes of them. She wrote constantly for years. A faint smile touched her expression. Never emails. Never phones unless necessary. Actual letters. Elena thought of the attic. The labeled boxes beneath the roof. Arthur. Letters. Marianne studied her for a moment before adding quietly, "Some stories take shape slowly. Don't rush the house." Then she returned behind the counter while the bell above the door rang softly. The rain had stopped by the time Elena returned to the lake. Clouds drifted low over the water, casting moving shadows across the shoreline. Wind stirred the trees gently as she carried groceries inside. The house felt unusually quiet that afternoon. Not empty. Reflective. As though the weather itself had slowed everything into stillness. Elena unpacked slowly, then carried Evelyn's book onto the porch with a blanket and tea. The lake stretched dark blue beneath the clearing sky while distant birds skimmed low across the water. She opened the book. Most of the essays focused on ordinary things. The smell of snow before storms. How certain afternoons made the lake appear silver instead of blue. The emotional difference between spring rain and autumn rain. Yet beneath every observation ran something deeper. A profound attentiveness to living. Evelyn wrote as though nothing small was ever truly small. Elena found herself rereading sentences slowly just to remain inside their atmosphere longer. Toward evening she came upon a passage that made her pause entirely. When someone leaves a place they loved deeply, traces remain in ways difficult to explain. Not haunting. Not memory exactly. A kind of emotional shape left behind in ordinary things. The porch suddenly felt colder around her. Elena stared out across the water. Wind moved through the pines in long soft waves. Far across the lake, Arthur's house remained partially hidden among trees. Emotional shape. The phrase described perfectly what she had sensed since arriving. Not ghosts. Presence. The feeling that Evelyn still existed somehow inside the rhythms of the house. The way the rooms held silence. The notes tucked into books. The music. As dusk approached, Elena returned upstairs. The attic door stood slightly open already. She climbed carefully beneath the sloping ceiling once more. Tonight the space smelled faintly warmer from the day's sunlight lingering in the roof beams. Dust floated gold in the late afternoon light. The labeled boxes remained stacked quietly along the walls. Elena approached them slowly. She told herself she was only curious about the letters because they might help her understand the emotional history surrounding the house. But beneath that rational thought lived another truth. She had become emotionally invested in Evelyn and Arthur. Not voyeuristically. Tenderly. The box labeled Arthur sat near the bottom shelf beneath folded blankets. Elena crouched beside it. For several seconds she only looked at the lid. Then she lifted it carefully. Inside lay dozens of envelopes bundled neatly with ribbon. Different years. Different handwriting. Some addressed from cities far from the lake. Montreal. Boston. Chicago. Arthur had written to Evelyn for decades. Elena touched the top envelope lightly but did not open it immediately. The intimacy felt immense. Finally, slowly, she unfolded one from the middle of the stack. The paper had yellowed slightly with age. Evelyn. The city feels unbearably loud tonight. I walked home in rain that smelled nothing like the lake and spent the entire evening thinking about your porch light. There's a kind of silence near you that I've never found anywhere else. I'll come back in October if work allows it. Leave the window open if the weather stays warm enough. A. Elena closed her eyes briefly. The emotional simplicity of the letter struck her harder than dramatic declarations ever could have. No performance. No exaggeration. Only longing shaped quietly into words. She read another. This 1 year later. The doctors say winter will be difficult for you. I know you'll pretend otherwise. I'm coming back before the first snow whether you ask me to or not. You once told me the lake teaches people how to stay. Maybe it finally taught me to. A. Elena lowered the paper slowly. Outside, evening deepened across the water beyond the attic windows. The letters revealed not tragedy, but endurance. Years spent circling back toward one another despite distance, time, separate lives. Not perfect love. Steady love. A different thing entirely. As she carefully retied the ribbons around the letters, another object beneath them caught her attention. A smaller wooden box. Unlabeled. Inside rested photographs, ticket stubs, pressed flowers, and several cassette tapes. One tape carried a handwritten label. For the nights the lake feels too quiet. Elena stared at it. Beside the tapes lay an old portable cassette player with headphones still wrapped carefully around it. She hesitated only briefly before placing the batteries correctly and pressing play. Static crackled softly. Then piano music filled her ears. Not polished recordings. Arthur playing privately, imperfectly, somewhere close to the microphone. After several minutes, the music stopped. A woman's laughter followed faintly in the background. Evelyn. You missed the ending again, she said softly. Arthur laughed too, low and warm. I was distracted. By what? A pause. Then. You breathing beside me. The tape clicked quietly before continuing with more piano. Elena removed the headphones slowly. Emotion rose unexpectedly inside her chest, not sorrow exactly, but overwhelming tenderness. These were not grand romantic artifacts preserved for nostalgia. They were ordinary moments someone couldn't bear to lose. Rain beginning outside a window. Laughter during unfinished songs. Letters folded and unfolded across years. The attic darkened gradually around her. She realized suddenly how long she had been upstairs. Downstairs, the old clock chimed 7 times. Elena closed the boxes carefully and returned them exactly where she found them. As she stood to leave, however, something slipped from between 2 books nearby and fluttered softly onto the floor. A photograph. She bent to retrieve it. Unlike the others, this image looked recent. Arthur and Evelyn sat side by side on the porch beneath blankets, both older now. Snow covered the railing behind them. Arthur held a mug while Evelyn leaned lightly against his shoulder. Neither looked toward the camera. They were watching the lake. On the back, in Evelyn's narrow handwriting, were only 6 words. Some people become part of your weather. Elena stood motionless in the dim attic holding the photograph. Outside, twilight deepened into blue-gray evening over the lake. Some people become part of your weather. The sentence felt almost unbearably true. Not just about romance. About human closeness itself. The people who shape the emotional climate of our lives so gradually we hardly notice until they're gone. Elena thought suddenly of her own apartment in the city. The failed relationship she rarely allowed herself to fully examine anymore. How strange it felt now to remember that life through the quiet perspective of the lake. Not less painful. Just farther away. As though distance and silence had finally given her room to see herself clearly again. When she came downstairs, darkness had settled fully outside. The house glowed warmly with lamplight against the windows. Elena lit candles throughout the living room and made soup while rain began softly once more against the roof. And right on time, across the lake, Arthur's porch light appeared. Tonight the piano began almost immediately afterward. Elena carried her bowl to the windows and listened. The melody sounded familiar. After a moment she realized why. It was the same unfinished song she had heard on the cassette tape upstairs. Arthur was still playing it. After all these years. The realization filled the room around her like warmth. She imagined him alone at the piano across dark water, unaware that someone inside Evelyn's old house now understood what the music meant. Not performance. Conversation. Memory carried nightly across the lake. Elena extinguished several candles before bed but left the living room lamp glowing softly beside the windows. The house felt gentler than ever tonight. Not mysterious now. Known. As she climbed the stairs, she glanced once toward the attic door hidden behind the coats. What was left behind inside the house was not unfinished grief. It was evidence that a quiet life, carefully lived and deeply shared, could leave warmth inside walls long after absence arrived. And outside, drifting softly across rain-dark water, Arthur's piano continued into the night like something still refusing to let the lake grow silent. Chapter 8: The Story the House Remembered. The following morning arrived with sunlight. After nearly a week of rain and drifting fog, the sudden brightness felt almost unreal. Golden light poured through the bedroom windows and spread across the wooden floors in long warm rectangles. Outside, the lake shimmered beneath a cloudless sky while gentle wind moved through the trees surrounding the house. Elena woke slowly, still carrying fragments of the letters in her mind. Some people become part of your weather. The sentence had remained with her long after she fell asleep. Now, standing at the window with bare feet against the cool floorboards, she looked across the water toward Arthur's distant shoreline. His porch light was gone in daylight. No music crossed the lake. Only calm morning silence. Yet the invisible connection between the two houses felt stronger than ever. For the first time since arriving, Elena no longer experienced the house as a mystery waiting to be solved. Instead, it felt like a story gradually remembering itself around her. Downstairs, sunlight transformed everything. Dust glowed gold above the bookshelves. The lake reflected moving patterns of light onto the ceiling. Even the old teacup beside the sink appeared softer somehow beneath morning brightness. Elena opened windows throughout the house. Fresh air drifted through immediately carrying the scent of pine needles warming in the sun. Somewhere near the shoreline below, waves touched stone in slow rhythmic movements. The world felt newly awake. She made breakfast slowly and carried it onto the porch. For a long while she simply sat listening to the lake. Boats moved faintly in the far distance now that weather had cleared. Birds crossed the open sky in small shifting groups. Wind chimes rang softly somewhere across the water near Arthur's porch. Everything here seemed connected through sound. The thought made her smile faintly. After breakfast, Elena decided to clean. Not because the house needed it badly, but because the impulse arose naturally. She opened curtains fully, dusted shelves, swept pine needles from the porch steps. The work felt strangely intimate. Caring for the house no longer felt like temporary occupancy. It felt relational. As though the place itself responded quietly to attention. By afternoon, sunlight had warmed the upstairs hallway enough to fill it with the faint scent of old cedar. Elena carried fresh linens toward the laundry room near the back staircase when something unusual caught her eye. A narrow section of wallpaper near the hallway corner had begun peeling slightly away from the wall. Perhaps the recent rain loosened it. Without thinking much about it, she pressed the edge gently back into place. But the wallpaper shifted farther outward instead. Behind it appeared a thin seam in the wood. Elena frowned. A hidden panel. She crouched carefully and slid her fingers along the edge until she found a small recessed handle nearly invisible beneath the trim. The panel opened with surprising ease. Inside was a shallow compartment built between the walls. And within it rested only one thing. A journal. Dark blue cloth. Worn edges. No title. Elena stared at it quietly before lifting it out. The compartment contained nothing else. No dramatic secrets. No hidden valuables. Only the journal. Sunlight from the hallway windows illuminated dust drifting around her as she sat carefully on the floorboards and opened the cover. The first page carried Evelyn's handwriting. If you are reading this, the house has decided to trust you. Elena exhaled softly. She turned the page. Unlike the notebooks upstairs, this journal contained longer entries. More personal ones. Not daily observations, but reflections written during significant moments of Evelyn's life. October 3rd. Arthur left for Chicago this morning. The lake looked enormous afterward. Strange how distance can alter the size of things. February 14th. I used to believe loneliness meant the absence of love. Now I think loneliness comes from having love with nowhere to place it. June 21st. We spent the entire evening listening to storms move across the water. He fell asleep in the chair near the fire while rain touched the windows. I remember thinking then that happiness is often quiet enough to miss if you aren't paying attention. Elena continued reading slowly while afternoon sunlight shifted across the hallway floor. The journal revealed decades unfolding in gentle emotional detail. Arthur leaving and returning repeatedly through the years because of work, family obligations, complicated lives elsewhere. Evelyn remaining at the lake. Not waiting exactly. Living. Teaching. Writing. Gardening. Watching seasons pass across the water. And always, somewhere within the rhythm of those years, Arthur returning again. One entry held Elena still for several moments. November 8th. People imagine unfinished love must feel tragic. But some stories resist ending because they were never meant to belong to ordinary shapes. I have loved him through distance more naturally than I could have loved most people through proximity. The house settled softly around Elena. Outside, wind moved gently through the trees. She understood now why the atmosphere surrounding the lake felt so emotionally unusual. The story between Evelyn and Arthur carried no bitterness. No dramatic collapse. Only longing stretched patiently across time. Another entry farther along made her chest tighten unexpectedly. December 16th. The doctor asked whether I had family nearby. I almost answered no. Then I looked through the window and saw Arthur rowing across the lake through snowfall because he forgot to bring bread yesterday. There are forms of devotion impossible to explain to strangers. Elena closed the journal briefly and leaned back against the wall. Emotion moved through her slowly. Not sadness. Recognition. For so much of her adult life, she had measured relationships through certainty, commitment, defined futures. Yet the story inside this house suggested another possibility entirely. That some connections mattered profoundly even without conventional endings. That love could exist quietly within incompleteness and still remain whole. The afternoon passed unnoticed while she read. By the time sunlight began softening toward evening, Elena reached the final pages. The handwriting there had grown shakier. Winter approaching again. Arthur insists on repairing the dock himself despite the cold. I pretend not to worry about him slipping on the ice. A few pages later. I asked him tonight whether he regretted anything. He said only this. That I spent so many years believing there would always be more time. Elena swallowed carefully. The last entry was brief. The lake froze early this year. Arthur played piano while snow covered the porch steps. I fell asleep listening to him across the water. If this house remembers me after I'm gone, I hope it remembers tenderness most clearly. That was all. No farewell. No dramatic conclusion. Only tenderness. Elena closed the journal slowly. The hallway around her glowed amber now with late afternoon light. The old house stood silent except for distant wind and shifting branches outside. Tenderness. The word seemed to live inside every room. She returned the journal carefully to the hidden compartment but left the panel slightly ajar. Not hidden anymore. Not from her. As evening approached, Elena found herself unable to remain indoors. She put on a sweater and walked down toward the dock while sunset spread across the lake in long ribbons of gold and pale rose. The water looked endless tonight. Light trembled softly across the surface while cool wind drifted through the shoreline pines. Across the lake, Arthur's house glowed warmly among the trees. And suddenly, without fully planning to, Elena made a decision. She walked back up to the house, retrieved the small rowboat tied near the shoreline, and pushed it gently into the water. The boat rocked softly beneath her as she climbed inside. For a moment she hesitated. Then she began rowing. The lake carried sound differently at dusk. Water touched the sides of the boat in slow hollow rhythms. Birds called faintly from distant reeds near the shore. Wind moved softly over open water. Elena rowed steadily toward the opposite shoreline while twilight deepened around her. Arthur's porch light grew brighter as she approached. She wondered suddenly whether this was inappropriate. Intrusive. Yet something deeper than curiosity guided her now. Not desire for answers. Desire for connection. The boat drifted gently against Arthur's dock at last. For several seconds Elena remained seated listening. Piano music floated faintly from inside the house. The same unfinished melody Arthur always played. Warm light glowed behind the windows. Finally she stepped onto the dock. The boards creaked softly beneath her weight. Before she could knock, the front door opened. Arthur stood there quietly as though he had expected her. Up close, he appeared older than Elena imagined. Tall but slightly stooped now. Gray hair falling loosely across his forehead. deep lines beside thoughtful eyes. Yet warmth radiated from him immediately. Not surprise. Recognition. "You're staying at Evelyn's house," he said softly. Elena nodded. "Yes." Arthur looked past her briefly toward the dark lake stretching behind the dock. Then he smiled faintly. "She said someone gentle would come eventually." The words startled Elena enough that she laughed quietly. "She said that?" "Often." He opened the door wider. "Come inside before the cold settles." Arthur's house smelled faintly of coffee, cedar, and old sheet music. The interior resembled Evelyn's house in subtle ways. Books stacked everywhere. Records beside the piano. Blankets folded carefully across chairs. But where Evelyn's house felt reflective, Arthur's felt lived in. Active. A kettle whistled softly somewhere in the kitchen. Arthur moved slowly but comfortably through the space while Elena stood uncertainly near the piano. "I hope you don't mind me coming," she said. "I don't." He placed 2 mugs on the table near the windows overlooking the lake. For several moments neither spoke. The silence between them felt strangely natural. Finally Arthur looked toward her carefully. "You found the letters." It wasn't a question. Elena blinked slightly. "How did you know?" A small smile touched his expression. "Because Evelyn always believed houses introduce people gradually." The answer sounded entirely sincere. Arthur wrapped both hands around his mug. "She loved that house more than anywhere else in the world," he said quietly. "Not because it was perfect. Because it listened." Outside, darkness settled fully across the lake. The 2 houses faced one another through the trees now, their windows glowing softly over black water. Elena looked toward the piano. "You still play for her?" Arthur followed her gaze. "Yes." No embarrassment. No hesitation. Just truth. The room fell quiet again. Then Arthur said something so softly she almost missed it. "The strange thing about grief is that love remains exactly the same size afterward." Elena felt something inside her chest shift painfully and beautifully all at once. Because suddenly she understood the lake completely. The music. The notes. The preserved rooms. The emotional atmosphere inside the house. None of it came from inability to let go. It came from refusal to stop loving simply because someone was gone. Outside, waves touched the dock gently beneath the dark. And across the water, the old house at the end of the lake glowed warmly among the trees, still carrying the story it had remembered all along. Chapter 9: Understanding the Silence. After that evening at Arthur's house, the lake no longer felt divided into separate shores. Something invisible had shifted. Before, Elena had experienced the 2 houses as distant reflections of one another, connected by memory, music, and mystery. But now the space across the water felt intimate, almost shared, as though she had finally stepped inside the emotional current that had quietly flowed between the houses for decades. The next morning she woke before sunrise. A pale blue darkness still covered the lake outside her windows. The world remained suspended between night and morning, silent except for the soft movement of water against the shoreline rocks below. Elena wrapped herself in a blanket and went downstairs. The house felt deeply calm at this hour. Not empty. Resting. She lit the fireplace carefully, watching flames spread slowly through the cedar logs. Warm light filled the living room while dawn gradually approached beyond the windows. Then she noticed something she had somehow overlooked before. On the shelf beside the record player stood a small framed sketch. Not a photograph. A drawing. The lines were simple but delicate, a view of the lake seen from the porch during winter. Snow covered the dock. Smoke drifted from Arthur's chimney across the water. In the bottom corner appeared a signature. A. Arthur. Elena lifted the frame gently. On the back, in faded pencil, someone had written, "For the mornings when distance feels heavier than usual." She stood quietly holding the sketch while the fire crackled behind her. Everything inside the house carried emotional intention. Not decoration. Not nostalgia. Care. That was what she had been sensing since arriving. Care preserved in objects, routines, notes, music, and memory. Outside, dawn finally began spreading silver across the lake. Elena made tea and sat beside the windows watching the world slowly brighten. Mist drifted low above the water in pale ribbons while birds crossed the sky in dark moving shapes. Somewhere across the lake, Arthur's porch light turned off. The sight filled her with unexpected comfort. A simple morning ritual repeated countless times through countless years. She wondered suddenly how many mornings Evelyn had spent sitting exactly where she sat now, watching for that distant light across the water. Probably enough for it to become part of her understanding of home. The thought lingered quietly inside Elena. Home. For so long she had imagined home as something stable and definable. A place built carefully through plans and certainty. But the lake suggested something softer. Perhaps home was simply where your emotional life became fully visible to itself. Later that morning, Elena walked into the woods behind the house. Sunlight filtered through the trees in shifting gold patterns. The recent rains had left the forest damp and fragrant with moss and cedar. Small puddles reflected pieces of sky between roots and stones along the path. She followed the trail farther than before, moving without urgency. The forest here felt ancient in its patience. Nothing rushed. Nothing demanded. At some point she reached the small clearing with the bench overlooking the lake. The water stretched brilliant blue beneath the brightening sky. Wind moved gently across the surface, creating long silver ripples. Elena sat. And for the first time in many months, she allowed herself to think honestly about the life she had left behind. Not just the exhaustion. Not just the loneliness. The relationship. Or what remained of it. She and Daniel had not ended dramatically. No betrayal. No shouting. Something quieter had happened instead. They had gradually stopped seeing one another clearly. Conversations became functional. Silences became heavy. Tenderness faded unnoticed until one day absence existed even while they occupied the same room. At the time, Elena blamed herself constantly. Maybe she had asked for too much. Maybe she had become distant first. Maybe modern life simply exhausted love eventually. But sitting beside the lake now, surrounded by the emotional residue of Evelyn and Arthur's long unfinished devotion, she realized something painful and freeing. Love did not disappear from lack of perfection. It disappeared from lack of attention. Evelyn and Arthur had spent decades noticing each other carefully despite distance, time, and complicated lives. Not because their connection was easier. Because they protected it. The realization settled inside Elena slowly. Wind moved softly through the birch trees overhead. Far across the water, Arthur's dock appeared faintly between the pines. She wondered whether he missed Evelyn every moment of every day. Probably not. Grief, she imagined, must eventually become less sharp and more woven into ordinary existence. A companion instead of an injury. The thought frightened and comforted her at once. When Elena returned to the house that afternoon, she found something waiting on the porch. A loaf of bread wrapped in cloth. Still warm. Beside it rested a folded note. The weather felt suitable for soup today. Elena smiled despite herself. The gesture felt perfectly natural within the strange quiet language of the lake. She carried the bread inside carefully. Outside, clouds had begun gathering once more over the water, softening the afternoon light into shades of silver and pale gray. By evening, rain returned. Not storm rain. Gentle, steady rain that blurred the windows and filled the rooms with soft ambient sound. Elena cooked soup exactly as Arthur predicted she might. She lit candles throughout the downstairs and played one of Evelyn's records while darkness settled around the house. The atmosphere felt almost dreamlike now. Warm lamplight. Rain against the roof. Jazz drifting softly through old rooms carrying decades of memory. At some point she found herself speaking aloud. Not to anyone exactly. Just into the quiet. You built a beautiful life here. The words surprised her. Yet they felt necessary somehow. As though the house itself deserved acknowledgement. The record ended softly. Rain deepened outside. Then, faintly through the weather, piano music began across the lake. Elena extinguished several candles and stepped onto the porch wrapped in a blanket. Cold mist touched her skin immediately. Arthur's music drifted over the dark water beneath the rain, softer tonight than usual. The melody carried long pauses between phrases, almost conversational in rhythm. Elena listened carefully. And suddenly she understood something else. Arthur wasn't playing for memory alone. He was continuing a ritual. A shared language that had once connected two houses across the water. The music mattered because love had shaped itself into habit over years. And habit, unlike passion, survives absence remarkably well. The realization filled her with profound sadness and comfort at once. Rain whispered around the porch roof. The lake disappeared almost entirely into darkness except for the distant yellow glow from Arthur's windows. Elena remained outside until the music stopped. Then she went upstairs feeling oddly peaceful. Several days passed quietly afterward. The weather shifted constantly between rain and sunlight. Elena read, walked, cooked, slept deeply for the first time in years. And gradually the ache she carried inside herself changed shape. Not healed entirely, but no longer sharp. One afternoon she drove into town for groceries and found Marianne arranging flowers outside the bookstore. "You look different," Marianne observed immediately. Elena laughed softly. "Different how?" "Quieter." They carried flower buckets inside together while bells chimed gently above the door. The bookstore smelled of coffee and damp coats from customers escaping rain. Marianne studied Elena thoughtfully. "The lake does that sometimes." "What?" "Reminds people who they are beneath all the noise." Elena wandered among the shelves while considering the words. Did it do that for Evelyn too? Marianne smiled faintly. "I think Evelyn always knew who she was." She adjusted a stack of books carefully. The lake simply gave her permission to live that way. The thought stayed with Elena long after. Permission. So much of modern life demanded performance. Productivity. Constant explanation. Yet Evelyn's life beside the lake seemed built around attentiveness instead. Listening. Observing. Loving carefully. Not a smaller life. Perhaps a deeper one. Before leaving town, Elena stopped near the marina. Rain had cleared again, leaving the docks shining beneath late afternoon sunlight. Boats rocked gently against their ropes while gulls drifted overhead. An elderly fisherman sat repairing nets near the shoreline. When Elena passed, he nodded politely. "You staying up at Evelyn's place?" The familiarity startled her less now. "Yes." He smiled softly. "She used to bring coffee down here every first snowfall." The sentence carried such casual affection that Elena smiled too. Everyone here remembered her through ordinary kindnesses. Not grand achievements. Small rituals. The fisherman returned to his work. After a moment he added, "Arthur still comes every Thursday morning. Sits right there near the end dock for an hour before sunrise." He pointed toward the water. "Never talks much." Elena looked toward the empty dock. "Why does he come?" The fisherman shrugged gently. "Some people keep loving long after there's anyone left to explain it to." The answer followed Elena all the way back to the house. That evening she found herself unable to remain indoors again. Twilight spread slowly across the lake while cold wind moved through the shoreline trees. Arthur's porch light had not yet appeared. On impulse, Elena carried one of the attic cassette tapes down to the living room. She placed it carefully into the old player and pressed play. Static crackled softly. Then music. Arthur's piano. After several minutes came Evelyn's voice again, clearer this time. "You always play slower when it rains." Arthur laughed quietly somewhere nearby. "Only because you listen more carefully." The recording continued with small ordinary conversations between songs. Weather. Bread baking. A bird hitting the window earlier that morning. Nothing important. And yet Elena felt tears rise unexpectedly in her eyes. Because this accumulation of ordinary tenderness, was the true story the house remembered. Not tragedy. Not loss. A lifetime of careful attention between two people. Outside, darkness deepened over the lake. Right on time, Arthur's porch light appeared. Then the distant piano began once more. Elena carried the cassette player onto the porch and listened to both recordings simultaneously, the younger Arthur preserved on tape and the older Arthur playing live across the water now. The effect felt surreal. Time folding softly inward around the lake. For several moments, the melodies aligned almost perfectly. Then drifted apart again. Wind moved through the trees overhead. And sitting there wrapped in blankets beneath the dark sky, Elena finally understood the silence she had felt since arriving. It was never emptiness. It was fullness without noise. The kind created when love becomes so woven into a place that even absence cannot entirely remove it. The house at the end of the lake remembered because memory lived not only in objects or rooms. It lived in repeated gestures. Music carried across water. Bread left on porches. Lights glowing faithfully through darkness. human tenderness continuing quietly long after explanation became unnecessary. And for the first time in years, Elena no longer felt invisible inside her own life. The lake had seen her too. Chapter 10: The Light Across the Lake. The morning Elena realized she would soon leave the lake arrived quietly. No revelation announced it. No sudden sadness. Only a soft understanding waiting for her when she opened her eyes. Outside, dawn spread pale gold across the water. The sky carried the muted blue-gray color that appears only in the final days of early spring, when winter has fully loosened its grip but summer still waits somewhere far beyond the horizon. The lake was perfectly calm. From the bedroom window, Elena could see Arthur's house across the water through drifting mist. His porch light still glowed faintly in the fading darkness, warm and steady among the trees. She stood there for a long while watching it. Over the past weeks, that distant light had become part of her mornings the same way it once belonged to Evelyn's. A quiet certainty. Proof that another human soul existed somewhere beyond the silence. The realization filled her with gratitude sharp enough to ache. Downstairs, the house remained cool from the night air. Elena wrapped herself in a sweater and moved slowly through the familiar rooms, touching objects almost unconsciously as she passed. The back of the kitchen chair. The worn edge of the bookshelf. The smooth wooden counter beside the sink. The house no longer felt borrowed. It felt known. She made tea and opened the porch door wide. Cold air drifted inside carrying the scent of pine and lake water. Somewhere beyond the shoreline, birds moved through the trees in restless morning bursts. The world felt awake but unhurried. Elena carried her tea onto the porch. Mist hovered low above the water while sunlight slowly gathered behind the hills. Across the lake, Arthur's porch light finally disappeared. Moments later, she saw him emerge from the trees near the dock carrying a small wooden crate. Even at this distance she recognized the calm steadiness of his movements now. He paused near the water briefly, looking out across the lake. Toward her house. Then he disappeared again. Elena smiled faintly into her tea. The silence between the two shores no longer felt empty. It felt conversational. That afternoon she walked into the attic one final time. Dust floated softly through sunlight beneath the sloping roof. The piano remained silent beside the windows overlooking the lake. The boxes. The photographs. The letters. Everything rested exactly as before. Yet the space felt different now that she understood it. Not preserved out of inability to let go. Preserved out of love. Elena crossed toward the hidden compartment in the hallway and retrieved Evelyn's journal once more. She carried it to the attic window overlooking the lake and opened to the final pages. If this house remembers me after I'm gone, I hope it remembers tenderness most clearly. Elena read the sentence slowly. Then again. Outside, wind moved silver ripples across the water. She thought about the first evening she arrived, the strange emotional atmosphere of the house, the feeling that ordinary objects carried invisible meaning. At the time, she believed mystery came from unanswered questions. Now she understood something gentler. Mystery came from the depth of ordinary lives. From realizing how much love could exist quietly between people without the world ever fully noticing. Evelyn and Arthur had not lived dramatically. They had simply paid attention to one another for a very long time. And somehow, that had transformed the lake itself. Elena closed the journal carefully. For several moments she remained seated beside the attic window while sunlight shifted across the floorboards around her. Then, almost without thinking, she spoke softly into the stillness. "I understand now." The attic answered only with quiet. Yet the words felt heard somehow. Later that evening, Arthur rowed across the lake. Elena saw the boat approaching just before sunset while she prepared dinner in the kitchen. The sight startled her, not because his visit felt unwelcome, but because until now she had always crossed toward his shore instead. She stepped outside as the boat touched gently against the dock below. Arthur looked older in evening light. Not fragile. Simply weathered by time and memory in the way lakeside trees become shaped gradually by wind. He carried a paper bag beneath one arm. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said as she met him near the shoreline. "Not at all." They walked slowly back toward the house together while twilight deepened across the water. Inside, Arthur paused almost immediately near the fireplace. His gaze moved quietly across the room. Not searching. Remembering. For several moments neither spoke. Then Arthur smiled faintly. "You moved the chair." Elena blinked in surprise. "The one near the windows," he explained gently. "Evelyn always kept it closer to the fire during winter." Elena looked toward the chair. Somehow the observation moved her more than it should have. "You notice everything," she said softly. Arthur laughed under his breath. "She taught me to." He handed her the paper bag. Inside was fresh bread and a small glass jar of orange marmalade. "She used to make that every spring," he said. "I found the recipe recently." They ate dinner together while darkness settled around the lake. Conversation moved easily between them, not forced or overly careful. Arthur spoke about storms that once froze the shoreline completely. About the winter he nearly fell through the ice trying to repair Evelyn's dock. About music. About silence. Sometimes long pauses settled naturally between sentences while wind moved softly outside the windows. Elena realized then that Arthur possessed the same emotional quality Evelyn's journals carried. Attentiveness. He listened fully before speaking. Not because he was quiet by nature, but because he understood silence wasn't absence. It was space. At one point Arthur looked toward the bookshelf near the record player. "She kept the blue record," he said softly. Elena followed his gaze. The vinyl rested exactly where Evelyn left it weeks or years earlier. "She played it during storms?" Arthur smiled. "Every first thunderstorm of spring." He stood slowly and crossed toward the shelf. When the music began, Elena recognized it immediately. The same soft piano recording she had first heard alone in the house during the storm weeks earlier. Arthur remained standing near the window while it played. For several moments his expression became distant, not lost in grief, but somewhere deeper inside memory. Finally he spoke without turning around. "You know," he said quietly, "people often assume love survives through remembering every detail." The record crackled softly between notes. "But that isn't true." He looked toward her then. "Love survives because certain people change the emotional shape of your life so completely that even ordinary days feel different afterward." The room fell silent except for music. Elena felt tears rise unexpectedly behind her eyes. Not sadness. Recognition again. Arthur sat back down slowly. "When Evelyn died," he continued softly, "everyone kept asking whether I planned to leave the lake. Outside, waves touched the dock below in slow rhythmic sounds. But leaving never made sense to me. He smiled faintly. The life itself was still here. The life itself was still here. Elena looked around the house. The records. The notebooks. The repaired teacup. The notes tucked into drawers. Everything carried that truth. Not relics. Continuations. The evening deepened around them gently. At some point the conversation faded entirely, replaced by comfortable silence while music played and candlelight flickered softly across the room. And Elena realized she no longer feared returning to her own life. Because the lake had changed something essential inside her. Not dramatically. Quietly. The way water shapes stone over time. Later that night, after Arthur rowed back across the dark water, Elena walked down to the dock alone. Stars covered the sky above the lake now, reflected faintly in the still black surface below. Cold air drifted through the shoreline trees while distant wind moved softly across the far hills. Across the water, Arthur's porch light glowed warm gold once more. Elena sat at the end of the dock wrapped in a blanket. The lake stretched around her in enormous silence. And for the first time since arriving, she no longer felt like a visitor inside it. She belonged to the story now too. Not permanently, but meaningfully. The realization filled her with calm. She thought about the person who arrived weeks earlier carrying exhaustion like a second skin. A woman who had forgotten how to hear herself beneath the noise of ordinary life. That version of herself already felt distant somehow. Not erased. Simply quieter. Above her, stars trembled softly between moving branches. Then, faintly across the water, piano music began again. Elena closed her eyes. The melody drifted through darkness exactly as it had the first night she arrived. But now she understood it fully. Not mourning. Conversation. Love continuing in the only form still available to it. Tears slipped quietly down her face. Not painful tears. The kind that arrive when something inside you finally loosens after being held too tightly for too long. The music continued. Water touched the dock gently beneath her feet. And somewhere deep within the enormous calm surrounding the lake, Elena understood the final thing the house had been trying to teach her all along. Healing was not forgetting. Healing was learning how to carry memory without letting it harden into loneliness. The piano faded slowly into silence. Yet the silence afterward no longer felt empty. It felt alive. Warm. Held. Elena remained on the dock long after the final note disappeared. Eventually clouds drifted across part of the sky, dimming the stars above the lake. Wind moved softly through the trees once more. Across the water, Arthur's porch light still glowed steadily through the darkness. A small human light. Simple. Faithful. Enduring. Elena watched it for a long time. Then, finally, she smiled. And behind her, nestled quietly among the trees at the end of the lake, the old house rested peacefully beneath the night. Still carrying tenderness inside its walls, still remembering every life that had ever loved there. The end.